The Nexus Institute for Advanced Theoretical Sciences floated majestically in the void between three star systems, because apparently nothing screamed we're intellectually superior, quite like building your university in the most inconvenient location possible. Its crystalline spires twisted through dimensions that lesser species couldn't even perceive, much less pronounce, and its admission standards were so exclusive that even cosmic background radiation had been rejected twice. Inside the gleaming conference chamber, where the walls themselves pulsed with equations that would make Einstein weep with joy or confusion, possibly both, the admissions committee gathered for their monthly ritual of crushing dreams with scientific precision. The beings assembled represented the galaxy's finest intellectual specimens, the Zephyrians, with their 12-dimensional brains that processed reality like a cosmic computer, the Ethereals who had transcended physical form so completely they had to rent bodies just to attend meetings, and the Mechanoids whose artificial intelligence had become so advanced they developed artificial anxiety disorders. At the head of the obsidian table that existed simultaneously in 17 different planes of existence, Professor Vexthela adjusted his bioluminescent robes with the practiced air of someone who had made a career out of being disappointingly superior. His species, the cerebral dominants, had evolved past the need for humor approximately 4 million years ago, which explained why his lectures were about as entertaining as watching entropy increase in real time. Next applicant, he announced in a voice that somehow managed to sound bored in 12 different languages simultaneously. The holographic display shimmered, revealing application number 4780 under 2091. One human female from the Backwater Sol system, age 23, standard galactic cycles. The committee members exchanged glances that somehow conveyed volumes of condescension without requiring any actual communication. Humans. How charmingly primitive. Quintessence. The ethereal representative who manifested as a vaguely humanoid cloud of smugness, practically vibrated with anticipated amusement. Oh, this should be entertaining. What does the little primate want to study? Theoretical physics, with a focus on consciousness-matter interaction, Vexthela read from the application, his tone suggesting he'd just announced that a particularly ambitious ant wanted to become an astrophysicist. The laughter that rippled through the chamber wasn't quite audible. Most of these species had evolved beyond such crude expressions. But the psychic resonance of collective mirth was palpable enough to short-circuit 3 nearby translation devices. Consciousness-matter interactions, Professor Null state, the mechanoid whose processing cores were apparently capable of experiencing irony. From a species that only discovered fire 50,000 years ago. How delightfully presumptuous. The human's thesis proposal materialized in the center of the table, its modest 200 pages looking absolutely pathetic compared to the standard Zephyrian dissertation, which typically required its own pocket dimension for storage. The committee members scanned through it with the kind of perfunctory attention one might give to a child's crayon drawing of their family. She proposes, Vexthela continued, his voice dripping with the kind of academic disdain that could wither tenure tracks at 50 parsecs, that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of the universe, capable of directly influencing quantum probability fields through what she calls intuitive resonance. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or the heat death of the universe. Then Dr. Quintessence began to laugh, actually laugh, which was concerning since ethereals weren't supposed to have functional vocal cords anymore. Intuitive resonance, she gasped between cosmic chuckles. Oh, that's precious. Next she'll probably suggest that emotional states can affect particle behavior, or that human gut feelings have some basis in quantum mechanics. Professor Helix Prime, whose species had been conducting advanced physics research since before Earth had figured out that the Sun wasn't actually orbiting around them, added his own assessment. The mathematics are quaint. She's essentially trying to quantify wishful thinking. How very human. The application was processed with the efficiency of a well-oiled bureaucracy that had perfected the art of rejection letters across 17 different galactic civilizations. The standard response was transmitted instantly, polite, professional, and devastating in its casual dismissal of everything the applicant held dear. Meanwhile, in a cramped apartment on Luna Station, the human girl stared at the rejection message on her beat-up terminal screen. The official seal of the Nexus Institute gleamed mockingly at the top of the communication, followed by 3 paragraphs of carefully crafted diplomatic language that essentially boiled down to thanks but no thanks. Primitive monkey person. She read it twice, then a third time, her expression never changing from that peculiar human blend of disappointment and stubborn determination that had carried her species from caves to starships in what the galaxy considered an embarrassingly short amount of time. Intuitive resonance isn't quantified wishful thinking, she muttered to her empty apartment, pulling up her research files with renewed purpose. It's just physics you're too scared to understand. Outside her window, the stars continued their ancient dance, completely unaware that somewhere in this vast cosmic joke, a rejected human girl was about to prove that sometimes the most primitive solutions were exactly what the universe had been waiting for. The galaxy's greatest minds had spoken. They'd made their judgment with all the wisdom and authority that 4 billion years of evolution could provide. They were about to discover just how spectacularly wrong superior intelligence could be. 6 months later, the human girl found herself wielding a molecular sanitizer in the bowels of the Kepler research facility, which was essentially the galaxy's most overpriced janitor training program, disguised as a cutting-edge science installation. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now literally cleaning up after the same species of brilliant minds who had deemed her unworthy of their intellectual company. Though to be fair, Zephyrian bathroom habits were so incomprehensibly complex that understanding them probably required at least a dozen advanced degrees anyway. The facility sprawled across 17 levels of gleaming laboratories, each one dedicated to pushing the boundaries of known physics in increasingly expensive ways. Down in sub-level 12, where the rejected and desperate came to earn their daily credits, she scrubbed quantum residue off equipment that cost more than most planetary defense budgets, while listening to alien researchers above complain about their impossibly difficult work. Another failed experiment, she muttered, mopping up the crystallized remains of what had once been someone's PhD thesis. The ethereal graduate students had been attempting to create stable micro-wormholes for 3 years running, burning through funding like a supernova burns through hydrogen, and somehow never quite grasping that their mathematical models were missing a rather crucial variable, the observer effect of consciousness itself. But here was the beautiful thing about being invisible to superior alien intellects. They never bothered to check what the cleaning staff was doing during off hours. Security cameras tracked movement, not motivation, and as far as the facility's AI was concerned, a human with a mop was about as threatening as a particularly ambitious houseplant, which was how she found herself, night after night, conducting unauthorized experiments in Laboratory C7, using broken equipment that just happened to need very specific repairs. The mechanoid researchers had discarded a perfectly functional quantum resonance chamber because it kept producing anomalous readings that didn't match their theoretical prediction. Apparently, when your entire worldview was based on cold, hard logic, anything that suggested the universe might have feelings was automatically classified as equipment malfunction. She'd been rebuilding the chamber piece by piece, requisitioning replacement parts under the brilliantly bureaucratic excuse that she needed to properly dispose of hazardous material. The facility's waste management system was so complex that nobody bothered to double-check whether dangerous quantum components were actually being destroyed or just relocated to sub-level 12 for temporary storage. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday, which was fitting because Tuesdays were universally regarded as the most unremarkable day of the Galactic Standard Week. She'd been running consciousness field measurements on crystallized water samples, because apparently even H2O had opinions about how it wanted to exist, when the readings spiked beyond anything the galaxy's most advanced laboratories had ever recorded. "Well, hello there," she whispered to the dancing particles on her jury-rigged scanner display. The quantum signature was unmistakable. Matter was actually responding to direct conscious observation, not just the mechanical act of measurement that traditional physics insisted was responsible for wave function collapse. The water molecules were literally reorganizing themselves based on her intent, her emotional state, her complete and utter humanness that the Nexus Institute had found so laughably primitive. For 3 weeks she ran the same experiment, with different materials, different emotional states, different levels of focus and intention. Every single test confirmed what she'd suspected since her undergraduate days on Earth. Consciousness wasn't just observing reality, it was actively participating in its creation. The universe, it turned out, was far more collaborative than the galaxy's greatest minds had ever imagined. The problem with conducting groundbreaking research in a facility filled with beings whose senses extended far beyond normal space-time was that eventually someone was going to notice the unusual energy signatures emanating from sub-level. The Zephyrian night shift supervisor, who perceived reality through 12-dimensional sensory organs that could detect quantum fluctuations from 3-star systems away, began investigating the strange readings that kept appearing on his monitoring equipment. Curious, he mused in his native language, which sounded like mathematics having an argument with itself. These patterns suggest deliberate consciousness-matter interaction, but that's impossible. There are no qualified researchers. Security protocols activated with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that had made galactic civilization possible, and had simultaneously made it insufferably boring. Automated systems began tracking the anomalous readings, cross-referencing them with personnel schedules, and building a profile of whoever was conducting unauthorized experiments in the facility's basement. But here was what the galaxy's most sophisticated security AI hadn't counted on. Humans were very, very good at hiding things, especially when those things involved the kind of desperate innovation that came from being systematically underestimated by everyone around them. She'd learned to mask her experimental signatures by conducting them during routine cleaning cycles, when the facility's massive quantum generators were already running at full capacity, and a little extra consciousness field activity could easily be dismissed as background noise. The night she finally achieved stable matter consciousness fusion, creating a small cube of crystallized spacetime that maintained its structure purely through focused human will. The facility's alarm systems nearly had what could only be described as an electronic nervous breakdown. Energy readings spiked, dimensional barriers fluctuated, and somewhere in the building's central AI core, several thousand lines of code spontaneously rewrote themselves in what appeared to be panic. She stood in her makeshift laboratory, holding a chunk of reality that shouldn't exist according to every physics textbook in the known galaxy, and smiled with the particular satisfaction that came from proving that sometimes the most primitive approaches were exactly what the universe had been waiting for. Above her, security teams scrambled to identify the source of readings that suggested someone had just casually violated several fundamental laws of physics. Below her, the foundation of everything the galaxy's greatest minds believed about consciousness, matter, and the nature of reality itself had just shifted in ways they weren't quite ready to understand. The hunt was on, but the prey had already become the predator. The universe, as it turned out, had a wicked sense of timing, and an even more twisted sense of humor. Just as the Kepler Research Facility's security systems were closing in on their mysterious basement experimenter, reality itself decided to throw what could only be described as a cosmic tantrum that made every previous galactic crisis look like a minor scheduling conflict. It started with the coffee machines. Across 17 different star systems, every single caffeine dispensing device simultaneously began producing beverages that tasted like existential dread mixed with the mathematical concept of purple. This might have been dismissed as a minor inconvenience. Alien coffee had never been particularly good anyway, except that the malfunctioning machines were also exhibiting properties that violated approximately 47 fundamental laws of physics. Then the gravity fluctuations began, not the gentle, predictable kind that happened when massive celestial bodies decided to waltz around each other, but the chaotic reality-bending kind that suggested space-time itself was having some sort of nervous breakdown. On Proxima Station, beings found themselves walking on ceiling. In the Andromeda Research Cluster, entire laboratories began existing in temporal loops, where Tuesday kept happening over and over again, which was particularly cruel since nobody liked Tuesdays to begin with. But it was the dimensional rift that appeared directly above the Nexus Institute for Advanced Theoretical Sciences that really got everyone's attention. The tier in space-time stretched across 17 different planes of existence, crackling with energies that made nearby reality hiccup in ways that were both scientifically fascinating and utterly terrifying. Through the rift, glimpses of alternate dimensions leaked through, universes where mathematics was purple, where consciousness was a physical substance you could mine like coal, and where the laws of physics were apparently more like gentle suggestion. Professor Vex Thala stood in the Institute's Emergency Command Center,
His 12-dimensional brain processing data streams that would have driven lesser species to madness, or at least very uncomfortable headaches. The readings were impossible, contradictory, and thoroughly insulting to everything he understood about the nature of reality. Status report, he demanded, his bioluminescent robes pulsing with the kind of agitated patterns that indicated a cerebral dominant was experiencing what other species might call panic, but which his people preferred to term aggressive intellectual concern. Quintessence materialized beside him, her ethereal form more translucent than usual, which was generally a sign that she was either deeply worried or experiencing some sort of existential formatting error. The rift is expanding at a rate of approximately 12 cubic parsecs per standard time unit. Our conventional containment protocols are proving inadequate. This was academic speak for absolutely useless, but saying so directly would have violated 17 different protocols for maintaining intellectual dignity during catastrophic failure. The assembled crisis team represented the finest minds the galaxy had to offer, mechanoids whose artificial intelligence could process quantum equations in real time, Zephyrians who perceived reality through dimensions that didn't technically exist, and ethereals who had transcended physical form so completely they had to remember to manifest bodies just to participate in meetings. They attacked the problem with the kind of methodical precision that had made their civilizations masters of the galaxy, and they were failing spectacularly. Attempt number 47, announced Professor Null State, his mechanical voice carrying undertones of what could only be described as artificial frustration. Initiating quantum stabilization field using modified Heisenberg compensator. The resulting explosion was visible from 3-star systems, and briefly turned the color spectrum inside out. The dimensional rift, rather than closing, seemed to develop what could only be described as a sense of humor, beginning to pulse in patterns that resembled cosmic laughter. Perhaps, suggested Dr. Helix Prime, whose species had been conducting advanced physics for longer than most civilizations had been sapient, we should consider alternative approaches. The traditional mathematical models seem insufficient. This was the academic equivalent of admitting that 4 billion years of evolutionary superiority might not actually mean much when reality itself decided to stop following the rules. The admission hung in the air like a particularly uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to acknowledge but everybody had to breathe. Meanwhile, 17 levels below in the Kepler research facility, she watched the crisis unfold on her cobbled-together monitoring equipment, with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from being right at exactly the wrong time. The dimensional rift pulsed with energy signatures that looked remarkably familiar, consciousness-matter interaction patterns amplified to cosmic proportion. Well, she muttered to her makeshift laboratory, which was now the only place in 3-star systems where the coffee machines were still working properly. Looks like someone finally managed to prove my theory. Too bad they're about to destroy half the galaxy doing it. The irony was almost too perfect. The galaxy's greatest minds, in their infinite wisdom and superior intellect, had apparently triggered the exact phenomenon they'd dismissed as primitive human wishful thinking, just 6 months earlier. The dimensional rift wasn't some random cosmic accident. It was consciousness-matter interaction gone catastrophically wrong. Reality responding to the collective panic and confusion of billions of highly evolved beings who suddenly found their fundamental understanding of the universe crumbling around them. Above ground, emergency broadcasts crackled across the galactic communication network as the situation deteriorated. The rift was feeding on the chaos it created, growing stronger with each failed attempt to contain it. Traditional physics wasn't just inadequate, it was making things worse, like trying to put out a fire with gasoline while insisting that combustion was a myth. In the depths of sub-level 12, she stared at her small cube of crystallized spacetime, the one stable example of controlled consciousness-matter interaction in a galaxy that was rapidly forgetting how to make coffee properly. The solution was sitting right there in her hands, literally glowing with the kind of humble human insight that the Nexus Institute had found so amusingly primitive. The question wasn't whether she could fix it. The question was whether the galaxy's greatest minds would be willing to admit that sometimes the most primitive solutions were exactly what the universe had been waiting for. Time, as it happened, was about to become a very relative concept, and pride was a luxury the galaxy could no longer afford. The moment when the galaxy's most advanced civilizations finally swallowed their considerable pride and asked a human janitor for help was not, as one might expect, accompanied by dramatic music or cosmic fanfare. Instead, it happened with all the dignity of a Zephyrian trying to operate a door handle designed for beings with only 3 dimensions of spatial awareness. Professor Vexdala materialized in sub-level 12, looking like someone had just informed him that his 12-dimensional brain had been running on outdated software for the past 4 million years. His bioluminescent robes flickered with patterns that roughly translated to, "I cannot believe I am about to do this, but reality is literally falling apart, and desperate times call for desperately humbling measures." She looked up from her workbench, where she'd been calmly adjusting the quantum resonance frequencies of her crystallized spacetime cube while the galaxy burned around her. The coffee she was drinking, the only properly functioning beverage in 17 star systems, sent up steam that somehow managed to look smug. "Let me guess," she said, without looking up. "Your 48 attempts at conventional solutions have failed. The dimensional rift is now large enough to park a small moon in, and someone finally remembered that there's a human down here who predicted this exact scenario 6 months ago." The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or the complete collapse of academic egos. Vexdala's robes dimmed to a shade that roughly approximated cosmic embarrassment. "Your theoretical framework," he began, each word apparently causing him physical pain, "regarding consciousness-matter interaction. Our models suggest it might be relevant to the current crisis." Relevant. She finally looked up, her expression carrying the particular brand of tired amusement that came from being spectacularly right at exactly the wrong time. "The dimensional rift is literally consciousness-matter interaction scaled up to galactic proportion. Your collective panic and refusal to accept non-traditional physics has been feeding it for the past 18 hours. But sure, let's call it relevant." The truth was both elegant and infuriating in its simplicity. The galaxy's greatest minds, in their infinite wisdom, had approached the crisis with the same rigid logical frameworks that had made them masters of conventional physics. But consciousness-matter interaction didn't operate on conventional logic. It operated on intuition, and the kind of quantum empathy that required you to stop thinking about the universe as a machine and start treating it like a living system that might actually have opinions about how it wanted to exist. "What do you need?" Vexdala asked, and somewhere in the background, the sound of 4 billion years of evolutionary superiority crashing to the ground was almost audible. 20 minutes later, she stood in the Nexus Institute's primary laboratory, surrounded by equipment worth more than most planetary economies, and alien scientists who looked like they were attending their own intellectual funeral. The irony was thick enough to cut with a quantum blade. The same beings who had dismissed her as a primitive monkey person were now hanging on her every word as she explained how to save the galaxy using principles they'd laughed off as wishful thinking. "The rift isn't feeding on energy," she explained, her hands dancing over control panels that responded to her touch with the kind of eager cooperation that equipment usually reserved for its original designers. "It's feeding on conflict, the fundamental disagreement between what you think reality should be and what it actually wants to become. Every time you try to force it closed using conventional physics, you're essentially arguing with the universe, and the universe is winning." She began modifying the Institute's quantum field generators, jury-rigging them with principles that made the assembled alien physicists' 12-dimensional brains hurt in new and uncomfortable ways. Instead of trying to contain the rift through brute force, she was preparing to communicate with it, to treat it not as a problem to be solved, but as a phenomenon to be understood and gently convinced to behave differently. "The solution," she continued, ignoring the expression of cosmic incredulity on Dr. Quintessence's translucent face, "is to stop fighting the rift and start collaborating with it. Consciousness-matter interaction works through harmony, not domination. You have to ask the universe nicely to fix itself, not demand that it comply with your mathematical models." The moment of truth arrived with all the ceremony of turning on a light switch. She placed her hands on the modified control interface, closed her eyes and did something that no advanced alien civilization had ever thought to try. She talked to the dimensional rift as if it were a living thing that might actually listen, The change was immediate and profound. The chaotic energies swirling through the tier in space-time suddenly shifted from destructive chaos to something resembling cosmic curiosity. The rift stopped expanding, stopped feeding on the panic around it, and began to pulse with patterns that looked remarkably like the quantum signatures of wonder and gentle amusement. Across 17 star systems, coffee machines began producing beverages that tasted like hope instead of existential dread. Gravity remembered how to behave properly. The temporal loops resolved themselves, much to the relief of beings who had experienced Tuesday 47 times in a row, and were beginning to develop serious chronological trauma. And in the space above the Nexus Institute, the dimensional rift began to close, not through force or mathematical coercion, but through the simple acknowledgement that sometimes the universe just wanted someone to pay attention to it with genuine curiosity instead of clinical detachment. The galaxy's greatest minds watched in stunned silence as a human girl who had been rejected from their programs 6 months earlier accomplished in 20 minutes what their combined 4 billion years of evolution had been unable to achieve. The dimensional rift sealed itself with what could only be described as cosmic satisfaction, leaving behind nothing but slightly confused space-time, and the lingering sense that reality itself was rather pleased with how things had turned out. Professor Vexthala stared at the readouts, showing normal dimensional stability, his 12-dimensional brain processing the implications of what had just occurred. The human had been right about everything. The consciousness-matter interaction, the intuitive resonance, the fundamental collaborative nature of reality itself. It was all exactly as primitive and unsophisticated and absolutely correct as she had claimed. Well, she said, setting down the control interface and picking up her mop with the casual air of someone who had just saved the galaxy and still had floors to clean. I should probably get back to work. These quantum residue stains aren't going to scrub themselves. And as she walked away, leaving behind a room full of the galaxy's most advanced beings, who were suddenly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about intelligence, consciousness and the proper way to interact with a universe that apparently had feeling. One thought echoed through their collective superior minds. They had dismissed her because she was human. That had been their first mistake, underestimating what humans could accomplish when they stopped trying to be like everyone else. That had been their last chat control,